Ilan Pappé, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. The Arab League Council, made up of the Arab states' foreign ministers, recommended the dispatch of arms to the Palestinians and the establishment of an all-Arab volunteer force to be called the Arab Liberation Army, Jais al-Inqath, literally rescue army from the verb anqatha, to rescue from imminent danger. The League appointed a Syrian general at its head. Later that month, small groups of this army began trickling into Palestine, thereby providing a welcome pretext for the consultancy to discuss the further escalation of the Haganah operations already underway. The pattern was set, and from this perspective, the month of December 1947 is perhaps the most intriguing chapter in the history of Palestine's ethnic cleansing. The mild reaction in the Arab capitals surrounding Palestine was welcomed by Ben-Gurion's consultancy, while the indifferent, almost lethargic Palestinian response disturbed them. In the first 3 days after the partition resolution was adopted, a small select group within the consultancy met every day, but they then relaxed somewhat and the format returned to the weekly Wednesday afternoon meetings of the High Command, with additional get-togethers of the smaller group a day after, usually at Ben-Gurion's home. The first meetings in December were devoted to assessing the Palestinian mood and intention. The experts reported that despite the early trickling of volunteers into the Palestinian villages and towns, the people themselves seemed eager to continue life as normal. This craving for normality remained typical of the Palestinians inside Palestine in the years to come, even in their worst crises and at the nadir of their struggle. And normality is what they have been denied ever since 1948. But the swift return to normality and the Palestinians' wish not to become embroiled in a civil war posed a problem for the Zionist leadership determined to reduce drastically, if not totally, the number of Arabs within their future Jewish state. They needed a pretext, and this, of course, would be more difficult to create if the moderate Palestinian reaction continued. Fortunately for them, at one point, the army of Arab volunteers expanded their acts of hostility against Jewish convoys and settlements, thus making it easier for the consultancy to frame the occupation and expulsion policy as a form of justified retaliation, tagmul in Hebrew. But already in December 1947, the consultancy had begun to use the Hebrew word yozma, initiative, to describe the strategy it intended to follow with respect to the Palestinians in the territory of their coveted Jewish state. Initiative meant taking action against the Palestinian population without waiting for a pretext for tagmul to come along. Increasingly, pretexts for retaliation would be conspicuously missing. Palti Sela was a member of the intelligence units that would play a crucial role in implementing the ethnic cleansing operations. One of their tasks was to report daily on the mood among and trends within the rural population of Palestine. Stationed in the northeastern valleys of the country, Sela was astonished by the apparent difference in the way the communities on either side reacted to the new political reality unfolding around them. The Jewish farmers in the kibbutzim and in the collective or private settlements turned their residencies into military outposts, reinforcing their fortifications, mending fences, laying mines, ready to defend and attack. Each member was issued with a gun and integrated into the Jewish military force. The Palestinian villages, to Selah's surprise, continued life as usual. In fact, in the three villages he visited, Ain Dur, Daburiya, and Ain Mahel, people received him as they had always done, greeting him as a potential customer for bartering, trading, and exchanging pleasantries or news. These villages were near the British hospital of Afula, where units of the Arab Legion were stationed as part of the British police force in the country. The Jordanian soldiers, too, seemed to regard the situation as normal and were not engaged in any special preparations. Throughout December 1947, Sella summed up in his monthly report: "Normalcy is the rule and agitation the exception. If these people were to be expelled, it could not be done as retaliation for any aggression on their part." On the top floor of the Red House on Wednesday afternoon, 10 December 1947, a disappointed consultancy met to assess the situation. Two speakers were leading the conversation: Ezra Danin and Yehoshua Palmon. Ezra Danin, as already mentioned, was a Citrus Grove businessman who had been invited into the intelligence corps because of his knowledge of Arabic. He was born in Syria. Danin was in his mid 40s when he joined the Haganah in 1940. In 1947, he became the head of its Arab section, which supervised the work of Arab Jews and indigenous Arab collaborators who spied for the High Command within the Palestinian community as well as in neighboring Arab countries. In May 1948, he assumed a new role, supervising the post occupation activities of the Jewish forces when the ethnic cleansing operation began in earnest. His people were responsible for the procedures that were followed after a Palestinian village or neighborhood had been occupied. This meant that, with the help of informants, they detected and identified men who were suspected of having attacked Jews in the past, or of belonging to the Palestinian national movement, or who simply were disliked by the local informants who exploited the opportunity to settle old scores. The men thus selected were usually executed on the spot. Danin quite often came to inspect these operations at first hand. His unit was also responsible, as soon as a village or town had been occupied, for separating all men of military age, namely between 10 and 50, from the rest of the villagers, who were then just expelled or imprisoned for long periods in POW camps. Yehoshua Jos Palmon was in many ways Danin's second in command and also took a great personal interest in the implementation of the policy of selection, interrogation, and sometimes execution. Younger than Danin and born in Palestine itself, Palmon already had an impressive military career behind him. As a recruit to a British commando unit, he had participated in the occupation of Syria and Lebanon in 1941 that brought French Vichy rule there to an end. The officers under Danin and Palmon's command were known to and feared by many Palestinians who quickly learned to spot them despite their attempts to dress anonymously in dull khaki uniform. They acted behind the scenes in hundreds of villages, and the oral history of the Nakba is full of references to these men and the atrocities they committed. But on 10 December 1947, Danin and Palmon were still hidden from the public eye. They opened the meeting by reporting that members of the Palestinian urban elite were leaving their houses and moving to their winter residences in Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. This was a typical reaction from the urbanites in moments of stress, moving to safety until the situation calmed down. And yet, Israeli historians, including revisionist ones such as Benny Morris, have interpreted these traditional temporary sorties as voluntary flight in order to tell us that Israel was not responsible for them. But they left with the full intention of returning to their homes again later, only to be prevented by the Israelis from doing so. Not allowing people to return to their homes after a short stay abroad is as much expulsion as any other act directed against the local people with the aim of depopulation. Danin reported that this was the only instance they had been able to detect of Palestinians moving towards areas outside the UN designated borders of the Jewish state, apart from several Bedouin tribes who had relocated closer to Arab villages out of fear of Jewish attacks. Danin seems to have been disappointed by this because almost in the same breath he called for a far more aggressive policy, despite the fact that there were no offensive initiatives or tendencies on the Palestinian side, and went on to explain to the consultancy the benefits it would have. His informants had told him that violent actions against Palestinians would terrify them, which will render help from the Arab world useless, implying that the Jewish forces could do whatever they wanted with them. What do you mean by violent action? Inquired Ben Gurion. Destroying the traffic, buses, lorries that carry agricultural products, and private cars. Sinking their fishing boats in Jaffa, closing their shops, and preventing raw materials from reaching their factories. How will they react? Asked Ben Gurion. The initial reaction may be riots, but eventually they will understand the message. The main goal was thus to assure that the population would be at the Zionists' mercy, so their fate could be sealed. Ben Gurion seemed to like this suggestion and wrote to Saret 3 days later to explain that the general idea, the Palestinian community in the Jewish area would be at our mercy, and anything the Jews wanted could be done to them, including starving them to death. It was another Syrian Jew, Eliyahu Sasson, who tried to some extent to play the devil's advocate in the consultancy. He seemed doubtful about the new aggressive approach Danin and Palmon were outlining. He had emigrated to Palestine in 1927 and was perhaps the most intriguing and also ambivalent member of the consultancy. In 1919, before becoming a Zionist, he had joined the Arab National Movement in Syria. In the 1940s, his main role was to instigate a policy of divide and rule inside the Palestinian community, but also in the neighboring Arab countries. He was thus instrumental in strengthening the alliance with the Jordanian Hashemite king over the future of Palestine, but his attempts to pit one Palestinian group against another would become obsolete now that the Zionist leadership was moving towards a comprehensive ethnic cleansing of the country as a whole. However, his legacy of divide and rule had its inevitable impact on Israeli policy in the years to come, as we can see, for instance, in the efforts Ariel Sharon made in 1981 when, as defense minister and on the advice of the Arabist professor Menachem Milsom, he attempted to undermine the Palestinian resistance movement by setting up so called village leagues as part of a pro Israeli outfit in the occupied West Bank. This was a short term and abortive endeavor. A more successful one was the incorporation, as early as 1948, of the Druze minority into the Israeli army within units that later became the principal tool for oppressing the Palestinians in the occupied territories. The 10 December meeting would be the last in which Sasson tried to persuade his colleagues that despite the need for a comprehensive plan, as he called it, namely the uprooting of the local population, it was still prudent not to regard the whole Arab population as enemies and to continue employing divide and rule tactics. He was very proud of his role in the 1930s in arming Palestinian groups, the so called peace gangs, that were made up of rivals of the Palestinian leader Al Hajj Amin al Husseini. These units fought against the national Palestinian formations during the Arab Revolt. Sasson now wanted to bring these divide and rule tactics to target some loyal Bedouin tribes. The consultancy not only rejected the idea of incorporating more collaborative Arabs, but they also went so far as to suggest putting behind them the whole notion of retaliation as adopted at the time on the advice of Ord Wingate. Most of the participants in the meeting favored engagement in a systematic campaign of intimidation. Ben Gurion approved, and the new policy was implemented the day after the meeting. The first step was a well orchestrated campaign of threats. Special units of the Haganah would enter villages looking for infiltrators, read Arab volunteers, and distribute leaflets warning the local people against cooperating with the Arab Liberation Army. Any resistance to such an incursion usually ended with the Jewish troops firing at random and killing several villagers. The Haganah called these incursions violent reconnaissance, Hasiyur Ha-Alim. This, too, was part of the legacy of Ord Wingate, who had instructed the Haganah in the use of this terrorist method against Palestinian villagers in the 1930s. Ord Wingate, the Englishman. In essence, the idea was to enter a defenseless village close to midnight, stay there for a few hours, shoot at anyone who dared leave his or her house, and then depart. Even in Wingate's day, this was already intended more as a show of force than a punitive action of retaliatory attack. In December 1947, Two such defenseless villages were chosen for the revival of Wingate's tactics: Deir Ayub and Beit Afa. When today you drive southeast of the city of Ramla for about 15 kilometers, especially on a wintry day when the typical thorny yellow gorse bushes of the inner plains of Palestine turn green, you come upon a bizarre view: long lines of rubble and stones stretching out on an open field surrounding a relatively large imaginary square area. These were the stone fences of Deir Ayub. In 1947, the rubble was a low stone wall that had been built more for aesthetic reasons than for the protection of the village, which had about 500 inhabitants. Named after Ayub, Job in Arabic, most of its people were Muslim, living in stone and mud houses typical of the area. Just before the Jewish attack, the village had been celebrating the opening of a new school, which already had the gratifying number of 51 pupils enrolled in it. All made possible by money the villagers had collected among themselves, and from which they could also pay the teacher's salary. But their joy was instantly obliterated when, at 10 o'clock at night, a company of 20 Jewish troops entered the village, which, like so many villages in December, had no defense mechanism of any kind, and began firing randomly at several houses. The village was later attacked three more times before being evacuated by force in April 1948, when it was completely destroyed. Jewish forces made a similar attack in December against Beit Afa in the Gaza Strip, but here the raiders were successfully repelled. Threatening leaflets were also distributed in Syrian and Lebanese villages on Palestine's border, warning the population: if the war will be taken to your place, it will cause massive expulsion of the villagers with their wives and their children. Those of you who do not wish to come to such a fate, I will tell them, in this war there will be merciless killing, no compassion. If you are not participating in this war, you will not have to leave your houses and villages.